The Frontier, 1840s. The spring melt had been coming down from the high peaks for 3 days straight. Audrey had watched the river swell each morning, turning from its usual silver thread into something darker, angrier. Now it moved like a living thing, carrying whole trees end over end, grinding boulders together with sounds that echoed through the canyon. She stood at the edge of her clearing with a bundle of firewood in her arms, calculating whether the water would reach her cabin if it rose another foot. 8 winters alone on this mountain had taught her to measure danger in inches. No one was coming to help her decide. There was no one for 30 miles. Then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. The crack and groan of splintering wood, something massive being torn apart. Audrey dropped the firewood and ran to the cliff's edge overlooking the valley trail. The old wooden bridge was gone, reduced to matchsticks tumbling in the current. And tangled in the wreckage, tipping slowly onto its side, was a carriage unlike anything she'd ever seen on the frontier. Black lacquer. Gold trim catching the weak sunlight. The kind of vehicle that had no business in this wilderness. The wind shifted, and she heard it clearly. Crying. 2 voices, high and desperate, cutting through the roar of water. Babies. Audrey didn't think. Her boots were already moving, carrying her down the steep embankment toward the river. The path turned to mud under her feet. Rocks shifted and rolled away beneath her weight. She grabbed at brush to keep from sliding, ignoring the thorns that tore her palms open. The water hit her legs first, ice-cold runoff from the snowpack, so frigid it stopped her breath. She waded in up to her knees, then her thighs. The current pulled hard, trying to sweep her downstream. A submerged log bumped against her shin, nearly knocking her over. She could see them now. 2 infants in a wicker basket, soaked and screaming, wedged against the carriage's overturned door. And slumped beside them, a man in clothes too fine for this country, dark wool, silver buttons, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. Audrey grabbed for the nearest solid thing, an uprooted pine lodged between 2 boulders. She locked her arm around it and reached for the basket. Her fingers closed on wet wicker. She pulled, and the basket came free with a sickening lurch. The weight of it nearly dragged her under. The babies screamed louder, terrified, their tiny faces red and contorted. Water sloshed over the rim of the basket. Audrey pressed it against her chest with one arm, still gripping the tree with the other. Her shoulder burned. The current hammered against her back, trying to pry her loose. She inched backward, step by brutal step. Her boots slipped on river stones. Cold water filled her lungs when she gasped. But she didn't let go. When her feet finally found solid ground, she staggered up the bank and set the basket down on a patch of grass well above the waterline. Both babies were alive, still crying. One of them, a girl, she thought, had her eyes squeezed shut. The other stared up at Audrey with a look of pure terror. Audrey turned immediately and went back. The carriage groaned, shifting in the current. She could see the exact moment the debris holding it would give way, a matter of seconds, maybe less. She plunged back into the water, deeper this time, and the river hit her like a fist. The man was unconscious, dead weight. She grabbed him by the collar of his expensive coat, velvet, she realized, impossibly soft under her calloused hands, and pulled. He slid partway out of the carriage, then caught on something. A strap. His boot wedged under the seat. Behind her, the babies screamed. Audrey yanked harder. The fabric tore. The man came free all at once, falling into the current. For a horrible moment, she thought he'd be swept away, but the water pushed him toward her. She caught him under the arms and started dragging him backward. He was far heavier than he looked. Every step cost her. Her legs shook. The cold was everywhere now, inside her bones, slowing her thoughts. She fell once, went under, came up gasping with his head still above water. The current pulled at her skirts, dragging her sideways. She dug her heels in and pulled again. One step. Another. The bank seemed impossibly far. Her vision narrowed to just the next foot of ground, the next handhold, the next breath. She didn't hear the carriage break free behind her, didn't see it vanish downstream. She only knew when her knees hit solid earth and the roar of the water became slightly more distant. She dragged the man up beside the basket and collapsed onto her hands, gasping. Water poured from her clothes. Her whole body shook violently. The rain had stopped. She hadn't noticed when. Audrey looked at what she'd pulled from the river, 2 infants who shouldn't have survived, and a man whose fine clothes marked him as someone important, someone from a world that had never had room for her. His chest rose and fell shallowly. Still alive. She had no idea what she'd just done to her life. But the babies were crying, and the temperature was dropping, and the man was bleeding into the mud. Audrey forced herself to stand. She lifted the basket, feeling the weight of it in her exhausted arms, and started the long climb back to her cabin. Behind her, the river swallowed the last remnants of the carriage and kept moving, indifferent, toward the valley below. Welcome back, my beautiful family. Before we begin, please click subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. Audrey had no milk. That was the first clear thought that cut through her exhaustion as she stumbled through the cabin door. The babies needed feeding, and she had nothing a child that age could take. No cow, no goat, nothing that could give them what their bodies demanded. She set the basket on the rough plank table and stripped away the soaked blankets with shaking hands. 2 infants, younger than she'd thought, maybe 4 months, maybe 5. A boy and a girl, she decided, though it was hard to tell through all the howling and red faces. The girl had stopped crying and was making a worse sound now, a weak mewing that barely carried. Her lips were turning blue. Audrey grabbed dry cloths from the shelf and wrapped each baby tightly, then pressed them both against her chest under her own coat. Her wet clothes soaked them immediately. She cursed and stripped off her outer layers, leaving only her thin cotton undershirt, and pulled the babies close to her skin. The boy's tiny hand found her finger and gripped with surprising strength. His eyes, dark, unfocused, stared up at her as though she were the only solid thing left in his world. Something twisted in Audrey's chest, sharp and unwelcome. She was 28. She'd never held an infant before, never wanted to. Children belonged to the world she'd been cast out of, the world of families and futures and homes that didn't perch on the edge of wilderness like a dare. But these 2 were here now, in her arms, depending on her for something she didn't have. Audrey turned her attention to the man. He lay where she'd dragged him, just inside the door, water pooling beneath him. She could see him clearly now in the lamplight, 35, maybe 40, with dark hair plastered to his forehead and a face that even unconscious carried an air of authority. His clothes confirmed everything the carriage had suggested. The velvet coat, the silk vest beneath it, the boots made from leather softer than anything she'd ever owned. Nobility. Had to be. Which meant the babies were probably his children. No one traveled through territory this dangerous with someone else's infants. Audrey eased the babies back into their basket, now lined with dry wool, and knelt beside the man. The gash on his forehead was deep but clean. She pressed a cloth against it until the bleeding slowed, then checked the rest of him for broken bones. His breathing was shallow but steady. No obvious fractures. She rolled him onto a pallet near the fire and stripped off his wet things, replacing them with a rough blanket. His skin was ice cold. The baby started crying again, both of them now, a sound that filled the small cabin and made thinking nearly impossible. Food. They needed food. Audrey stood and went to her stores. Dried meat, cornmeal, beans, flour. Nothing soft enough. Then she remembered the goat's milk Mrs. Hendricks had traded her last month, powdered, in a tin at the back of the cupboard. It wasn't fresh, and it wasn't a mother's milk, but it might keep them alive. She heated water, mixed the powder carefully, and tested the temperature on her wrist the way she'd seen women do in town years ago. When it seemed right, she dipped a clean cloth into the mixture and let the boy suck on it. He latched on immediately, desperate. The girl took longer to accept it, but eventually her tiny mouth worked at the cloth, drawing the milk drop by drop. Audrey sat on the floor between the basket and the unconscious nobleman, one hand holding the cloth for the babies, the other resting near the man's pulse point to make sure he was still breathing. Outside, the river continued its rampage through the valley. Inside, the fire crackled. And Audrey realized, with a sinking certainty, that the life she'd built in careful solitude had just been washed away as completely as that bridge. The man woke violently just before dawn. Audrey heard the sharp intake of breath from across the cabin and turned in time to see him lurch upright, eyes wild, one hand reaching for something that wasn't there. A weapon, she guessed. He scanned the room like a cornered animal, his gaze landing on her with such sudden intensity that she froze mid-motion, still holding the cloth she'd been using to feed the girl. "Where are they?" His voice was hoarse but commanding, the kind of voice that expected immediate answers. "The children, where?" "Alive," Audrey said quietly, not moving. "Both of them. In the basket behind you." He twisted around so fast he nearly fell, grabbing the edge of the table for support. When he saw the two infants sleeping in their makeshift bed, wrapped in her spare blankets, something in his posture shifted. Not quite relief, more like a man remembering how to breathe after nearly drowning. Then his attention snapped back to her, and the suspicion returned. "Who are you?" He pushed himself to standing, swaying slightly, one hand pressed to his bandaged forehead. "Where is this place? How did you?" He stopped mid-sentence, seeming to notice for the first time that he was wearing nothing but a rough wool blanket. His eyes narrowed. "What have you done with my clothes?" "Drying by the fire," Audrey said evenly. "You were half frozen. Sit down before you fall down." He didn't sit. Instead, he moved toward the babies, his steps unsteady but determined. Audrey stepped aside, letting him check on them himself. His hands, unmarred by work, she noticed, the hands of someone who'd never split firewood or hauled water, touched each infant's forehead gently, checking for fever, then counted fingers and toes with the careful precision of someone confirming a terrible loss hadn't occurred. "They're well enough," Audrey said. "Hungry every 2 hours, but alive." The girl was worse off. Took her longer to warm up. He looked at her then, really looked, his gaze traveling from her worn boots to her plain cotton dress to her face, and she saw the exact moment he categorized her. Common. Poor. Irrelevant. "You pulled us from the river." It wasn't quite a question. "The carriage went into the water 3 days ago. I got you out before it went under completely." 3 days. His hand went to his forehead again, wincing. I've been unconscious for most of it. You woke twice, delirious. Didn't make much sense either time. She moved to the stove, needing something to do with her hands. I'm making coffee. You should eat something. I need to send word. He started looking around the cabin, searching for something. Is there a telegraph office nearby? A town? I must get a message to. He stopped abruptly, as though catching himself. Audrey poured coffee into 2 tin cups, noting how carefully he'd bitten off that sentence. Nearest town is Stillwater. 30 miles southeast, through terrain you're not fit to travel yet. No telegraph there anyway. You'd have to make it to Fort Collins for that. How far? Week on horseback. 2 weeks on foot. Longer if the roads are still flooded. She handed him a cup. Which they are. He took it but didn't drink, his jaw tightening with frustration. The girl started to whimper, and before Audrey could move, he set down the coffee and lifted her carefully, supporting her head with a practiced ease that told her everything. These were his children, and he'd held them many times before. My name is John, he said suddenly, too casually, while adjusting the blanket around the baby. John Ashby. Audrey said nothing. She'd heard enough lies in her life to recognize the pause before a false surname, the slight overemphasis on the fake name as though repetition would make it real. Audrey, she offered, because not giving her name would seem suspicious. Miss Audrey. He inclined his head in a gesture so naturally aristocratic it might as well have been a formal bow. I'm in your debt. She watched him settle back onto the pallet with the baby still in his arms, his posture rigid even in exhaustion, and thought that John Ashby, or whoever he really was, carried his secrets as obviously as he carried that unconscious nobility. Whatever he was running from had found its way to her mountain. And from the way he kept glancing toward the shuttered window, he expected it to find him again soon. Audrey saw them from the ridge on the 4th morning. She'd climbed up to check her snares, leaving John. She still thought of him by his false name, with the babies and strict instructions not to open the door for anyone. The sun had barely cleared the eastern peaks when she spotted the dust rising from the valley trail below. 6 riders, moving in a deliberate search pattern along the riverbank. Even from this distance, she could see the colors. Dark blue coats with gold trim, the same gold that had glinted on the wrecked carriage. His people. Or someone's people. She dropped flat against the rocks and watched them work their way upstream. They moved slowly, stopping frequently to examine debris caught in the shallows. One rider dismounted and waded into the water, pulling at something tangled in the roots of a fallen cottonwood. He held it up, a piece of black lacquered wood, then tossed it aside and moved on. They weren't calling out. Weren't shouting names or blowing horns. They were looking for bodies, not survivors. Audrey felt her stomach tighten. She watched for another 10 minutes as they methodically picked through the wreckage strewn along the bank, occasionally conferring in voices too low to carry up the mountain. Their movements had the careful patience of men who expected to find corpses, not rescue the living. When they finally moved out of sight around the river bend, she stayed flat for another 5 minutes, making sure they wouldn't double back. Then she ran. The cabin looked exactly as she'd left it, smoke rising from the chimney, shutters closed, nothing to suggest anyone was inside. But smoke meant life, and life meant questions she couldn't afford to answer. She burst through the door. John was standing by the window, the boy in his arms, angling to see through a gap in the shutter. Get away from there. Her voice came out sharper than she'd intended. Now. He turned, startled by her tone, and saw whatever was in her face that made him obey without argument. "Put out the fire," she said, already moving. "All of it. Use the water bucket, then scatter the embers. Make it look like it's been cold for days." "What's happening?" "Riders in the valley. Your colors." She grabbed the basket with the girl still sleeping inside and carried it toward the back room. "They're searching the riverbank." She heard him draw in a sharp breath. "How many?" "6. Maybe more by now." She turned back. "If they're yours, why are you worried?" His face had gone carefully blank, the kind of blankness that confirmed every suspicion she'd been harboring. "I can't be certain they're mine." "Not anymore." "Then we hide everything." "The babies stay quiet. Do they have anything that can make noise?" "Rattles, toys?" "Nothing. It was all in the carriage." "Good. You stay in the back room with them. Don't come out no matter what you hear." She was moving through the cabin now, grabbing anything that looked new or expensive. His dried clothes, still too fine for anyone who'd live up here. The silver buttons she'd cut from his vest. A monogrammed handkerchief she'd found in his coat pocket. She shoved them all into a grain sack and buried it under the floorboards beneath her bed. "What if they come up here?" His voice was steady, but she could hear the fear underneath. "They might. I'm known in these parts as a hermit woman who doesn't welcome visitors. That usually keeps people away, but if they're thorough." She grabbed a broom and started sweeping away the extra tracks near the door, the evidence of more than one person moving around. "Then I'm a widow woman living alone who hasn't seen anyone in weeks. You and the children don't exist." He nodded slowly, understanding. "And if they search the cabin?" "They won't get the chance." She met his eyes. "But if they do, you stay silent and hidden. Because if those men are looking for bodies instead of survivors, there's a reason they'd prefer to find you dead." The boy started to fuss, and John pressed him gently against his shoulder, murmuring something too quiet to hear. The tenderness of the gesture contrasted sharply with the fear in his eyes. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of horses whinnying somewhere down the mountain. Audrey doused the fire with water, watching the steam rise and dissipate. The cabin grew immediately colder. She scattered the wet ashes until they looked days old, then moved to the window and peered through the crack in the shutter. Nothing yet. But they were coming closer. She could feel it. The cough started on the 7th night. Audrey woke to the sound of it, wet, rattling, the kind of cough that meant fluid in the lungs. She was out of bed before she was fully conscious, crossing the dark cabin to where the babies slept. The boy was quiet, but the girl, Becky, John had finally called her, was struggling to breathe between coughs that shook her tiny body. Audrey lifted her carefully. The baby's skin was burning hot. "How long?" John appeared beside her, already reaching for his daughter. In the week since the search party had passed without stopping, he dropped some of his careful guard. Not all of it, but enough that she'd learned the children's names. Becky and Thomas. Twins, as she'd suspected. Just started. But it's bad. Audrey pressed her ear to the baby's chest and heard the congestion clearly. Lung fever, maybe worse. She needs medicine I don't have. What medicine? I'll pay anything. There's no store, John. She used his false name deliberately, a reminder that they were still playing this game. The herbs I need grow wild, up in the high meadows. Mullein root and wild cherry bark. Maybe some coltsfoot if I can find it. He looked toward the shuttered window. Outside, wind howled around the cabin's corners. The secondary storm that had been building all day had finally arrived, bringing sleet that hammered against the roof like gravel. "You can't go out in this." "I don't have a choice." Audrey was already moving, pulling on her heaviest coat, gathering her canvas bag and digging knife. "That cough will get worse before morning. Without the medicine, she won't last 2 days." Becky coughed again, a terrible sound that ended in a weak cry. Thomas woke and started crying in sympathy, and John stood holding both of them, looking more helpless than Audrey had ever seen him. "I don't know what to do," he said quietly. "If she worsens while you're gone, keep her warm. Not hot, just warm. Give her water on a cloth if she'll take it. Don't let her lie flat, prop her up so the fluid can drain." Audrey pulled on her boots, lacing them tight. "If the cough gets worse, take her outside for a few minutes. The cold air sometimes helps open the airways. And if that doesn't work..." She met his eyes. "Then you pray I get back in time." The storm hit her like a fist the moment she stepped outside. Sleet mixed with snow, driven horizontal by wind that cut through her coat as though the wool were paper. She pulled her hood tight and started climbing. The meadows were 3 miles up, through terrain dangerous even in good weather. Tonight, with ice forming on every surface and visibility reduced to a few feet, it was nearly suicidal. But Audrey had walked these mountains for 8 years. She knew every switchback, every reliable handhold, every place where the path narrowed to inches. She climbed in the dark, feeling her way more than seeing it. The sleet turned to snow an hour in, heavy and wet, soaking through her gloves. Her hands went numb. She fell twice, catching herself on rocks that tore her palms open. The second time, she slid 10 feet before a juniper bush stopped her momentum. When she finally reached the high meadow, the wind was screaming across the open ground. She dropped to her knees and started digging through snow with her bare hands, searching for the distinctive furry leaves of mullein. Her fingers were so cold she could barely feel them anymore, but she kept digging, moving in a grid pattern, systematic despite the storm. She found the mullein after 20 minutes of searching. The roots came up frozen, and she had to chip away ice to expose them. Wild cherry was harder. She had to range wider, checking 3 different stands of trees before she found one old enough to have the thick bark she needed. By the time she had everything, she'd lost feeling in her feet. The climb down was worse than the climb up. The path had turned to ice. She fell hard twice more, once nearly going over the edge of a drop that would have killed her. She caught herself on a rock outcropping, dangling for a terrifying moment before her boots found purchase. When she finally stumbled through the cabin door, ice crusted in her hair and her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the bag, John was pacing with Becky pressed against his chest. The baby's cough had gotten worse, each breath a labored wheeze. "I have it," Audrey managed through chattering teeth. "Start water boiling. Hot as you can get it." She collapsed onto the bench and started preparing the medicine with fingers that barely worked, knowing that everything, the climb, the storm, the risk, would mean nothing if she was already too late. Becky broke the fever on the 3rd day. Audrey woke to find the baby sleeping peacefully, her breathing finally clear and steady. The terror that had gripped the cabin for 72 hours released all at once, leaving exhaustion in its wake. She slumped against the wall and closed her eyes, too tired to move. When she opened them again, pale sunlight was streaming through the shutters and John was watching her from across the room with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You should eat something," he said quietly. "You haven't slept more than an hour at a time since you came back from that mountain." Neither have you. I wasn't the one who climbed through a blizzard with torn hands and frozen feet. He stood and moved to the stove, where something was heating. Soup, she realized. He'd made soup from her stores while she slept. She looked down at her hands. The cuts from the rocks had scabbed over, but the skin around them was still angry and red. She'd been too focused on Becky to treat them properly. John brought her a bowl and sat down beside her, closer than he'd ever allowed himself before. In the morning light, she could see how much the past 2 weeks had changed him. The aristocratic bearing was still there, but softer somehow, worn down by fear and gratitude and nights spent caring for sick children. "Let me see," he said, gesturing to her hands. "They're fine. They're infected." It wasn't a request this time. He took one of her hands before she could pull away, turning it gently to examine the wounds. His touch was careful, clinical. "You have salve." Shelf above the basin. He retrieved it and began cleaning the cuts with a competence that surprised her. "I wasn't always useless," he said, reading her expression. "Before I inherited he stopped, catching himself. "Before certain responsibilities fell to me, I spent time in field hospitals during the border campaigns. I've dressed worse wounds than these." Border campaigns. She studied his face. "That would make you military. Officer class, given your age and bearing." A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "You're observant." "I'm a hermit, not an idiot." She watched him work, noticing the way his hands moved with practiced efficiency. "John Ashby isn't your real name." "No." He applied salve to the worst of the cuts, his attention focused on the task. "Does it matter?" "Probably should. Men with false names usually bring trouble. The trouble was already following me. You just happened to be in its path." He finished with her right hand and moved to the left. "Why do you live up here alone? A woman with your skills could manage well enough in a town." "Towns don't want me." "Why not?" Audrey was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a bird called from somewhere in the pines. Finally, she said, "I was born in Philadelphia. My father was a clerk, my mother died young. When I was 17, a merchant's son took an interest in me. Said he wanted to marry me." She paused, the old bitterness rising. "What he wanted was something else. When I refused him, he told everyone I'd tried to seduce him. Tried to trap him into marriage." John's hand stilled on hers. "His family had money and reputation. I had neither. They made sure everyone knew his version of the story." She pulled her hand free and pushed up her sleeve, revealing a long scar that ran from her elbow to her wrist. "This is from his mother. She came at me with a letter opener in the middle of the street, called me a whore loud enough for half the town to hear. When I defended myself, they said I'd attacked her. My God. I left Philadelphia that night with nothing but what I could carry. Moved west, kept moving until I found a place where no one asked questions." She looked around the cabin. "This mountain doesn't care about my reputation. Doesn't care that I'm ruined in polite society. It just asks whether I'm strong enough to survive it." John was quiet for a long time. Then he rolled up his own sleeve, revealing a puckered scar across his forearm. "Knife wound. My brother gave it to me 3 months ago during what was supposed to be a private family dinner." Audrey stared at the scar, then at him. "Your brother tried to kill you." "Not tried. Intends to. Those men searching the river weren't looking for survivors, they were making sure there weren't any." He met her eyes. My name is Geoffrey Asher, Duke of Somerville. And my brother wants my children dead so he can inherit everything. The title hung in the air between them like something physical. A duke, Audrey said finally. On my mountain. A duke who would be dead without you. A duke whose children would be dead. Geoffrey's voice was steady. Titles don't mean much when you're drowning. Becky stirred in her basket, making a small sound. They both turned toward her, but she settled back into sleep. We're the same, you and I, Geoffrey said quietly. Cast out by people who should have protected us. The difference is you chose your exile. Mine was forced. Audrey looked at this man, this duke, who'd spent the last 3 days holding his dying daughter while Audrey prepared medicine with bleeding hands. Who'd learned to change soiled blankets and heat milk at 2-hour intervals and ask for help when he didn't know what to do. The gap between them was still there. But it felt smaller now, measured in shared scars rather than social station. Your brother, she said. He'll keep looking. Yes. Then we'd better make sure he doesn't find you. Geoffrey found the locket by accident. He'd been looking for extra blankets in the trunk beneath Audrey's bed. Becky was finally well enough to sleep through the night, but the cabin had grown colder as November settled into the mountains. His hand brushed against something wrapped in oilcloth at the very bottom, tucked beneath linens that looked like they'd never been used. He should have left it alone. Should have respected her privacy. But the weight of it felt familiar in a way that made him curious, and before he could think better of it, he'd unwrapped the cloth and opened the small wooden box inside. The locket was silver, tarnished with age but unmistakably fine work. He recognized the craftsmanship immediately, the kind of piece that came from London's better jewelers, not something a clerk's daughter from Philadelphia would own. He turned it over and felt his breath catch. The seal engraved on the back was one he'd seen 100 times in his father's study. The crest of the Earl of Thornbury. What are you doing? Geoffrey turned to find Audrey in the doorway, her arms full of firewood. Her eyes went to the locket in his hands, and something in her expression shuddered closed. I was looking for blankets. I didn't mean to. Put it back. Her voice was flat, but he could hear the tension underneath. He stood slowly, the locket still in his palm. This seal. Do you know what it means? It means you should put it back and forget you saw it. Audrey. He kept his voice gentle. This is the Thornbury crest. The Earl was a close friend of my father's. I met him several times before he died. That would have been, 10 years ago now. She set down the firewood with more force than necessary. 12 years. And he wasn't my father, if that's what you're thinking. Then how? My mother was his mistress. The words came out sharp and bitter. Before she married my father, before I was born. He gave her the locket when he ended things, probably to ease his conscience. She kept it hidden her whole life, and when she died, it came to me. Geoffrey looked down at the locket again, seeing it differently now. Did your father know? He knew. He married her anyway, raised me as his own. But after he died, after that merchant's son made his accusations. She crossed her arms. His family found out about my mother's past. They made sure everyone knew. Said it proved what kind of woman I was, that sin ran in the blood. That's not fair. True. Audrey laughed without humor. Doesn't matter. Respectability isn't about truth. It's about what people believe, and they believed I was my mother's daughter in every way that mattered. Geoffrey turned the locket over in his hands, thinking of the Earl, a good man by most accounts, but one who'd kept a mistress and then sent her away with a piece of jewelry as compensation. The hypocrisy of it suddenly struck him as obscene. Thornbury had 3 legitimate children, he said quietly. 2 sons and a daughter. I met them once or twice. They never mentioned. Why would they? Acknowledging bastard blood would have been beneath them. She moved to take the locket from him, but he closed his hand around it. Wait. The daughter, her name was Elizabeth. She married Lord Hartwick's youngest son about 15 years ago. He looked up at Audrey. She would be your half-sister. She would be nothing to me. We've never met, and we never will. But you could have. If circumstances had been different, if your mother. If my mother had been born into the right family, or if the Earl had married her instead of using her, or if any number of things had been different, yes. I could have grown up in a manor house instead of learning to shoot rabbits for dinner. Audrey's eyes were hard. But none of that happened. I'm not part of that world, Geoffrey. I never was, and your fancy seal doesn't change anything. He heard the way she used his real name, not John, but Geoffrey. A small intimacy, even in anger. It changes one thing, he said. You're not just a clerk's daughter. Your blood is as good as half the people who cast you out. My blood. She took the locket from him now, holding it like it weighed far more than silver should. This is what happens when blood matters more than character. The Earl's legitimate children have titles and estates. I have a cabin in the wilderness and a piece of jewelry I can't even sell without inviting questions I don't want to answer. She wrapped the locket back in its oilcloth and returned it to the trunk, closing the lid with finality. The world you come from, she said, not looking at him, is the same world that destroyed me. Don't try to tell me I belong there just because some earl couldn't keep his trousers buttoned 40 years ago. Geoffrey wanted to argue, to point out that her connection to the Thornbury family could have protected her if anyone had known, could still protect her now. But he looked at the set of her shoulders, at the way she held herself as though braced for another blow, and understood that the locket represented everything she tried to leave behind. You're right, he said finally. I'm sorry. She glanced at him, surprised. The world I come from, he continued, is the same one that decided my brother should get everything just because he was born first. The same one that would rather see my children dead than allow a woman I love to. He stopped abruptly. Audrey went very still. A woman you love? Geoffrey realized what he'd said. The words had come without thought, but now that they were spoken, he couldn't take them back. Thomas started crying from his basket, breaking the moment. Audrey moved to pick him up, and Geoffrey let her go, his heart hammering against his ribs. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the first hints of snow that would soon trap them on this mountain until spring. The rider appeared 2 weeks later, flying colors Geoffrey recognized immediately. Audrey spotted him first from her position near the woodpile. She dropped the axe and ran for the cabin, bursting through the door with her face flushed from cold and alarm. Rider coming up the eastern trail. Dark blue coat, gold trim. Same colors as the search party. Geoffrey moved to the window, his heart suddenly pounding. Through the gap in the shutter, he could see a single horseman picking his way carefully up the mountain path. The man rode slowly, deliberately, scanning the trees as though searching for something specific. He's alone, Geoffrey said. That's unusual. My brother's men always travel in pairs at minimum. Could be a scout. Or a messenger. Geoffrey recognized the saddlebags now, official courier bags bearing the Somerville seal. Someone who doesn't know I'm supposed to be dead. Audrey was already moving, gathering the baby's things, preparing to hide them in the back room as they'd practiced. But Jeffrey caught her arm. "Wait. Wait. Jeffrey, if he sees you. If he's a legitimate messenger, he could carry word back to my allies. People who would protect the children, who could help expose my brother's plot." He looked at her. "This might be my only chance to get help before winter traps us here completely." He could see her processing this, weighing the risks. Outside, the rider had stopped at the edge of the clearing, looking toward the cabin with obvious uncertainty. "Or your brother could have sent him specifically to flush you out," Audrey said. "A lone rider looks less threatening than 6 armed men." "That's possible." "Possible?" She pulled free of his grip. "It's exactly what I'd do if I wanted to trick someone into revealing themselves." The rider dismounted and began walking toward the cabin, leading his horse. Jeffrey could see him more clearly now, young, maybe 25, with the bearing of minor nobility. Someone trained to carry sensitive messages, not to kill. "I know him," Jeffrey said suddenly. "That's William Crosby. His father serves on my council. He's trustworthy." "You thought your brother was trustworthy once." The words hit harder than she'd probably intended. Jeffrey watched William approach the cabin door, clearly preparing to knock. In that moment, he had to decide, stay hidden and let the opportunity pass, or reveal himself and risk everything. He thought about what revealing himself would mean. Messages sent. His allies mobilized. A return to London, to his estate, to all the responsibilities and dangers of being the Duke of Somerville. Courts and councils and enemies who wore friendly faces. A life where Becky and Thomas would grow up surrounded by tutors and etiquette and the weight of expectations. A life where Audrey had no place. She would never fit into his world. The London drawing rooms that had destroyed her once would destroy her again. She'd suffocate in corsets and calling cards, die slowly in a world of false smiles and careful words. He could protect her from his brother's assassins, but he couldn't protect her from the 1,000 small cruelties of polite society. And he couldn't ask her to endure that. Not after everything she'd done for him. William knocked on the door. "Your Grace." His voice carried through the wood. "I bear urgent messages from the council. If you or anyone who knows your whereabouts can hear me, I beg you to respond. Your brother has claimed the title. He's telling Parliament you died in the river with your children." Jeffrey's hand was on the door latch. One movement and William would see him. One word and his old life would come flooding back. He looked at Audrey. She stood holding Thomas, her expression unreadable. She wasn't going to make this choice for him. She'd already made her position clear, she'd hide him as long as he needed hiding, but she wouldn't be part of any return to his former world. "Your Grace, please." William's voice held genuine desperation now. "The estate is in danger. The tenants are suffering. Your brother is making changes that," he paused. "I'll wait by the clearing for 1 hour. If no one comes, I'll assume the worst and return to London." Jeffrey heard footsteps retreating. Through the window, he watched William lead his horse back toward the tree line, then settle down on a fallen log to wait. 1 hour. 60 minutes to decide between duty and desire, between the title he was born to and the life he'd found in this wilderness. Becky made a small sound from her basket. Audrey shifted Thomas to her other arm and moved to check on her daughter. No, not her daughter. His daughter. Who would grow up either as nobility or as no one, depending on what he chose in the next hour. "What are you going to do?" Audrey asked quietly. Jeffrey looked at her, at this woman who'd pulled him from death, nursed his children through fever, shown him what it meant to survive on courage rather than title. He thought about waking up in this cabin every morning, teaching Thomas and Becky to track deer and red weather signs, growing old with rough hands and an easy conscience. He thought about never seeing his ancestral home again, never reclaiming his title, letting his brother win. "I don't know," he said, and meant it. Outside, William waited, his horse grazing peacefully in the weak winter sunlight. The hour began to pass. Geoffrey never got the chance to make his choice. William Crosby had been waiting at the clearing's edge for 40 minutes when the arrows came. The first one took him through the shoulder, spinning him sideways. The second caught his horse in the neck. The animal screamed and bolted, and William collapsed behind the fallen log, shouting a warning that was drowned out by the thunder of approaching riders. Geoffrey saw it all from the window. 6 men emerged from the tree line, moving fast, wearing his brother's colors. They'd been watching, waiting to see who William would flush out. They followed him, Audrey said, already moving. "We have to run. Now. There's nowhere to run. They've surrounded the clearing." Geoffrey grabbed his coat. "How many rifles do you have?" "1. Maybe 20 rounds." She was wrapping the babies in blankets, working with swift efficiency. "Geoffrey, we can't fight 6 armed men." "We can if we're smart about it." He turned to her. "You know this terrain. Where are the weak approaches?" She stopped, understanding flooding her face. "Not flight. Defense. Eastern side," she said quickly. "The ground drops off steep. They'd have to dismount and climb, leaves them exposed. Western side has that deadfall I've been meaning to clear, good cover for us, obstacle for them. Northern approach. Dense pine. They'd have to come through single file. And south. Wide open. They'll come from there first." She met his eyes. "We make our stand at the western deadfall. You take the babies to the root cellar. Remember where you showed me, under the cabin floor? Hide there with them. I'll hold the western position." "Absolutely not. You've never fought on this mountain, and you're still recovering from." The cabin window exploded inward. Geoffrey threw himself over the baby's basket as glass rained down. An arrow quivered in the wall where his head had been. "Root cellar," he said again. "Now." But Audrey was already grabbing her rifle and a leather satchel. "The cellar floods in winter. They'll freeze. We fight together or we die together." There was no time to argue. Geoffrey lifted both babies while Audrey pulled up the loose floorboard and lowered them into the shallow space beneath. She lined it with every blanket they had, creating a nest that might keep them warm and hidden. Thomas started to cry. "Please be quiet, sweet boy," she whispered, then placed a kerchief soaked in lavender water near them, an old trick to calm infants. "Please." The crying softened to whimpers. She replaced the floorboard and threw a rug over it just as something heavy slammed against the door. "Through the back," Geoffrey said. They went out the rear window, dropping into the snow, and circled around to the western deadfall. Audrey moved like smoke through the terrain, her body remembering every root and stone. Geoffrey followed as best he could, his tactical training warring with his unfamiliarity with the ground. They reached the deadfall, a massive tangle of fallen pine that created a natural fortification. Audrey dropped behind it and aimed her rifle toward the southern approach. "I count 6, Geoffrey breathed, scanning the clearing. "No, 7. 1 stayed back with the horses." "William?" Still alive. He's crawled under that log. Jeffrey watched the men spread out, testing approaches. They're being cautious. They don't know how many of us there are. Good. Let's keep them guessing. Audrey fired a shot that kicked up snow near the lead rider's feet. He jerked his horse back with a curse. You missed. I never miss. I'm making them nervous. She reloaded with practiced speed. They have to come through that narrow gap between the cabin and the cliff. When they do, you take the ones on the left, I take the right. Jeffrey had his pistol, the one Audrey had recovered from his coat and dried carefully. 6 shots. He'd have to make them count. The men dismounted. Smart. They were going to approach on foot, using the cabin for cover. They'll try to flush us out, Jeffrey said. Probably burn the cabin. Let them. Everything that matters is already out here. Audrey's voice was steady, but he could see her hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, from cold. She'd run out without gloves. He took off his own and handed them to her. She started to protest, then accepted them with a nod. The first man broke from cover, running low toward their position. Jeffrey fired, catching him in the leg. The man went down screaming. The others dove for cover, their confidence shaken. 5 able-bodied, Audrey said. But they'll regroup fast. We need to thin them out before they coordinate an attack. I have an idea. Can you make it to that pine stand north of here without being seen? Yes. Do it. Fire from there, make them think we're surrounding them. I'll hold this position. Move every time you shoot, make them think there are more of us. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Don't die while I'm gone. Same to you. She melted into the forest like she'd been born to it. Jeffrey watched her go, then turned his attention back to the men. They were regrouping, arguing. He could hear fragments of conversation, orders about flanking, about fire, about making sure there were no survivors. His brother's orders. Kill everyone. Burn everything. From the north, Audrey's rifle cracked. One of the men clutched his arm and fell. The others scattered, suddenly unsure of where the threat was coming from. Jeffrey fired twice more, deliberately missing but coming close enough to drive them back toward the eastern approach, the steep, exposed one. They were winning. Actually winning. Then the cabin's roof caught fire. The flames spread fast, consuming the dry timber roof in minutes. Jeffrey's first thought was the babies, but no, they were under the floorboards, beneath stone foundation that wouldn't burn. His second thought was that his brother's men had just made a fatal mistake. The smoke was blowing south, directly into their positions, while he and Audrey held the high ground upwind. From the pine stand, Audrey's rifle spoke again. Another man went down. The remaining 4 broke discipline. They ran for their horses, coughing, half-blind from smoke. Jeffrey stepped out from the deadfall and fired 3 careful shots. 2 men fell. The others kept running. Audrey emerged from the trees, reloading as she moved. She dropped to one knee and fired twice more. One rider tumbled from his saddle. The last man made it to the horses and fled down the mountain trail at a gallop, abandoning his companions. Then there was silence, broken only by the crackling of flames and the groaning of men too injured to run. Jeffrey ran for the cabin. The fire had engulfed the roof completely, but the walls still stood. He kicked open the door, dropped to his knees, and tore up the floorboard. Smoke was seeping in, but beneath it, both babies were alive, crying lustily now, furious and frightened but breathing. He pulled them out one at a time, carrying them into the cold clean air. Audrey was there immediately, taking Becky, checking her over with desperate thoroughness. "They're all right," Jeffrey said, coughing. "They're all right." Behind them, the cabin collapsed inward with a sound like thunder. Audrey stared at the burning wreckage, 8 years of her life, everything she owned, reduced to ash and ember. Her face was expressionless, but Jeffrey saw her hands tighten on Becky's blanket. "We need to secure the wounded," she said finally. "And check on William." The messenger was still alive, barely. Audrey bound his shoulder while Jeffrey dealt with the 3 men who could still move. He tied them efficiently, then went through their pockets. Letters. Orders. All bearing his brother's seal, all explicitly commanding the elimination of the pretender duke and his bastard heirs. Evidence. Finally, undeniable evidence. William looked up at him through pain-glazed eyes. "Your Grace. You're alive." "I'm alive." Jeffrey helped him sit up. "And you're going to carry a message back to London for me. Can you ride?" "I can try." "Tell the council everything you saw here. Tell them about these orders. Tell them," he paused, looking at Audrey, who was holding both babies now, her back to the burning cabin. "Tell them the Duke of Somerville is coming home. And he's bringing his family." William's eyes widened slightly, following Jeffrey's gaze to Audrey. Understanding dawned. "Your Grace, I'll need time to prepare the household for, a duchess of unconventional background might face certain." "She'll face nothing," Jeffrey said quietly. "Anyone who has a problem with my choice can take it up with me directly." "Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, Your Grace." They got William onto the calmest horse and sent him down the mountain with the prisoners tied and walking behind. Jeffrey watched until they disappeared around the bend, then turned to find Audrey watching him. "A duchess," she said. "You told him I was going to be a duchess. I should have asked first." Jeffrey crossed to her, carefully avoiding the burning debris. "I'm sorry. I presumed." "You presumed I'd want to go back to that world. The one that destroyed me." "No. I presumed you might want to come destroy it with me." He took Becky from her arms so she was only holding Thomas. "Everything that happened to you, everything they said about you, it was because you had no power, no protection. But as my wife, as the Duchess of Somerville, you'd have both. You could face down every person who ever cast you out. You could rewrite their rules. Or I could stay here. Rebuild. You could." He looked at the smoldering cabin. "But winter's coming, and this place is compromised. My brother knows about it now. He'll send more men." She was quiet for a long moment, staring at what remained of her sanctuary. The place she'd built to escape the cruelty of polite society was gone, transformed into something that could no longer protect her. "I don't know how to be a duchess," she said finally. "I don't know how to survive in the wilderness. We'll teach each other." Thomas grabbed at her coat with his tiny fist, as though casting his vote. Becky had fallen asleep against Jeffrey's shoulder, exhausted from fear and crying. "They'll say terrible things about me," Audrey said. "About where I came from, about my mother. They'll call me a fortune hunter, an opportunist. They'll say I seduced you while you were vulnerable. Let them. I'll tell anyone who asks that you saved my life 3 times over. That you're the reason my children are alive. That you're the strongest person I've ever met." He shifted Becky carefully and reached for Audrey's hand. I'm not asking you to become something you're not. I'm asking you to come with me and show them what you are. She looked down at their joined hands, his still soft despite weeks of rough living, hers scarred and calloused and capable. I don't love you because you're convenient or appropriate, Jeffrey continued. I love you because you jumped into a river without hesitation. Because you climbed a mountain in a blizzard to save my daughter. Because you're terrifying and competent and you don't flinch. He paused. And because for the first time in my life, I know exactly what kind of person I want beside me when everything falls apart. Audrey was quiet for so long he thought she might refuse. Then she looked up at him, and something in her expression had changed. Not softened, exactly. But opened. If I do this, she said, I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not. I won't apologize for surviving. I won't bow and scrape to people who think they're better than me because of accidents of birth. Good. And I'm keeping my rifle. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. The corner of her mouth twitched. Almost a smile. Then yes, she said. Let's go teach your world that the woman who saved the Duke of Somerville isn't someone they can ignore. They salvaged what they could from the cabin's edges, clothes, a few supplies, the silver locket that had somehow survived in its trunk. Then they started down the mountain together, two babies between them, heading toward a future that would scandalize London and rewrite both their stories. Behind them, the cabin burned down to its foundation, and the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the ashes like a benediction. The mountain kept their secrets. But the world below would soon know the truth, that sometimes destiny arrives not in a gilded carriage, but in the calloused hands of a woman who refuses to let anyone drown.
Wow, we made it to the end. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, the best way to support me is super simple. Just hit like and subscribe. Takes 1 second but helps me create more stories for you. Speaking of which, I've got another one ready to go. Click the next video on your screen now and let's continue. See you there.